Imagine one day you wake up at home. You get out of bed and drink a glass of water. You look for plane tickets for a trip to some interesting place. You no longer need visas, permits, or quotas. You can fly to any point on the planet without any trouble and stay there as long as you want. You no longer read the news feed with excitement because there's no news about a possible war with China or another act of terror by Islamic extremists. You are no longer frightened by the nuclear threat from Russia. If you provide any services, it is no longer a problem for you to sell your product anywhere on the planet without any permit, paperwork, or bureaucratic limit. Congratulations, you are a citizen of United Earth. A world where there are no more wars, where the very phenomenon of war is impossible because there are no political sides to conflict. There are no longer 200 corrupt bureaucratic governments controlling 20 to 30% of the world's economy. That money no longer ends up in their pockets. There are no more multi-million person armies, no more hundreds of planes, ships, and nuclear bombs to maintain at the cost of billions of dollars. The freed resources are directed towards science, medicine, and environmental protection. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Let's figure it out. Hello, you're on the Techno-socialism channel. My name is Dmitro Koshovy, and here we talk about futurology, the future, and political and economic systems. I'm from Ukraine, where a war is currently ongoing, and it's very clear how extreme and ineffective decisions lead to problems. But despite that, I consider myself an ideologist of human development. If you find this kind of content interesting, hit like and subscribe. It will motivate me to release content more often. What is a global state? Why is it logical? Today we have a planet on which 7 to 8 billion people live. Economic systems vary, but generally they are forms of capitalism with different levels of regulation and taxation. 20 to 30% of global GDP is under the control of governments of more than 200 states with varying levels of corruption. A significant part of these resources is spent on internal conflicts and armies. A successful experience in one region is not exported to others, and if there is an acute crisis in one part of the world, another part remains indifferent to solving that problem. Moreover, humanity is divided by different languages, religions, radical cultures, and the levels of education and sanitation differ greatly. This is the political economic reality of today, which in no way can be called effective. A global state suggests itself. It is a logical, universal solution to the thousands of problems of billions of people, eliminating their root causes. But how might such a state look? Politically, administratively? What kind of government is needed? What political and economic system? There can be different answers to these questions, but in the best case it requires very serious research. Fortunately, this doesn't have to be done from scratch, since there are already many examples in science fiction. Humanity in the Star Trek universe has already realized this idea, united, enlightened, technological with unified rules. But this is far from the only example. Isaac Asimov in Foundation depicts the Galactic Empire, a centralized superstate spanning thousands of worlds, which ultimately decays due to bureaucracy and stagnation. In Dan Simmons's Hyperion we see the hegemony of man, an interplanetary structure connected by instantaneous travel technology but internally unstable. Arthur C. Clarke in The City and the Stars shows a utopian but completely inert society, global, safe, conflict-free, and completely paralyzed by the fear of the new. The opposite side, dystopias. In Orwell's 1984, the global superstate Oceania is hellish control, ideology, and censorship in pure form. And in the anime Psycho-Pass, the entire planet is effectively subordinated to a system that assesses people's mental states, global security, in exchange for a complete abandonment of privacy. And there is also Mass Effect with the Citadel Council, an interspecies political body that regulates interplanetary relations, a completely different scale, but the logic is the same: centralization, coordination, complex balancing of interests. All this are examples of how different authors imagined one humanity, or something like it, from utopia to dystopia, from a wise council to a digital dictatorship. But now, let's quickly imagine how united humanity might look in reality. Administrative system. Modern states are divided into regions. If a state is large, it has two levels of administrative division, regions and districts. If we are talking about the entire planet, it makes sense to introduce three levels. Under such a system, a modern country would effectively become a region within the united planet. In other words, effectively, governments remain, but their powers are greatly reduced. Individual countries would no longer be able to have armies and their own law enforcement systems. This would make war impossible and substantially cut spending, legislation, and law enforcement system. A global state means a single legal system for the entire planet. it also means a single law enforcement system. In theory, this would allow for fighting crime much more effectively, since now drug cartels or other criminal organizations can easily evade responsibility simply by changing citizenship or location. A single police force, a shared database, and AI support would make any crime transparent, and the inevitability of punishment would inevitably reduce the crime rate. Language and religion. These are two very powerful factors of people's disunity. It's a bit easier with language, it is mostly just a means of communication, and hatred of foreign languages occurs only in a few nations. Global humanity could quite easily adopt English as a base language, while preserving native languages in the regions. Such practices are already implemented in many countries for convenience. Religion is much more complicated. You might think it's enough to separate church and state and guarantee complete freedom of religion, but it's not so simple. Different religions have existential contradictions at their core and cannot peacefully coexist. If you move jihad from a war between Israel and Iran to clashes between Jews and Muslims somewhere within a single city, the situation doesn't really improve. Religions have always been a means of controlling the masses, and unless humanity evolves to new forms of higher morality, incompatible religions will make the very idea of a united humanity impossible. In that case, humanity would effectively be a soup of cultures, religions, races, and peoples, like London or Manhattan. Next, we'll talk about the destructive and constructive versions of such a state, because many things can be organized in different ways. But before that, let me say a few words about why a global state is not the same as globalization, which everyone talks about. You might think it's simply the next stage. Modern globalization is purely an economic process. It doesn't involve moral or cultural integration, and it happens not because humanity has matured, but because it's profitable for business, as it opens up new markets. It's also beneficial for consumers, because global competition yields better goods and prices. Modern globalization has never thought in deeper terms. A common government, common laws, and a common morality are not its goal. Globalization today is an instrument of corporations. Traditional globalists are transnational corporations, and traditional anti-globalists are local nationalist governments, often corrupt or dictatorial. That is why the terms global state and globalization are not the same. The idea of a united humanity is not new. People have always aspired to create one great order, one system, one world empire that would put an end to chaos. History is a series of attempts to build a global state long before the word globalization even existed. Let's start with the Roman Empire. It brought law, roads, administration, a civilizational order sustained by discipline and bureaucracy. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, sounded like a promise of harmony, but that peace stood on the bones of conquered peoples, and when the empire grew so much that it could no longer digest its own greatness, internal erosion began. Civilian apathy, corruption, the divide between the center and the provinces, and Rome, which wanted to be eternal, became ruins. Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire was another world unification project, very loosely organized, but still, almost half of humanity came under its rule. The Mongols paved trade routes, united Eurasia, provided stability, but their power was built on fear, and fear doesn't last forever. Once that fear disappeared, the empire crumbled into dust like a nomad's tent after a storm. The British Empire was built on another idea, an economic one. We do not conquer, we civilize. By civilize, they meant building factories, railways, spreading Christianity, and colonial administrations. As a result, half of the map of the world was painted red. But the price of civilization was the plundering of the colonies, slavery, and wars. And when the oppressed peoples began to speak in their own voices, the empire on which the sun never set was extinguished. After World War II, the stage changed, but the script remained the same. The Soviet Union dreamed of a single ideological state, a world without exploitation, without borders, with one faith. Man is a friend, comrade, and brother to man. In practice, however, an apparatus of control, fear, and bureaucracy arose. The idea of equality drowned in queues for sausage, and the fear of the KGB. When the system lost its idea, it collapsed under its own weight. And after the collapse of the USSR, the United States rose to the throne of the global policeman. Under the banner of democracy and human rights, the world gained a global market, the internet, and endless wars for peace. American hegemony tried to conquer not territory, but consciousness. And when others realized this, an age of antagonism began. China, Russia, Iran, each with its own vision of an alternative world order. So all the empires that tried to become global fell because human dignity cannot tolerate the forceful imposition of language, culture, or rules of the game, and because free people do not want to be colonies in someone else's empire. Every nation, especially one living under frequent wars or oppression, has a very strong sense of its own identity. Good times dull this feeling and open society to multiculturalism, internationalism, etc. Bad times, on the contrary, strengthen the sense of one's own tribe. I know well what I'm talking about because I experienced this in Ukraine. If you had come to Kiev in 2021, you would have found a lot in common with Berlin. We had many foreigners, multiculturalism was the norm, the majority communicated in Russian, the minority in Ukrainian, and English could be heard everywhere. Bars, festivals, ruin pubs, art spaces were thriving, all that kind of thing. And if you had to visit Kiev in the spring of 2022, I swear, you wouldn't find more people united around their nation, country, and people anywhere else. Only Ukrainian was heard, and there was a feeling of security, a sense that all Ukrainians who are not Russians were our own. It's very hard to explain in words. Over time this feeling faded a bit, but the attack itself and the danger incredibly united Ukrainians and strengthened nationalism. Language, religion, blood and traditions, as well as nationality and skin color. These are the key markers, the triggers of our own. People not only persecute others based on these traits, but also unite on their basis. And all the identities mentioned are obstacles to the global unification of humanity. A Ukrainian would in no way want to unite with Russians after the bombing of Ukrainian cities, the loss of relatives, arrogance and humiliation. Israelis wouldn't want to unite with Palestinian Arabs, or even more so, with radical Muslims. Armenians would not want to unite with Azerbaijanis. The feeling of our own is especially strong when there is pain and loss. And if you tell such people, just forget everything, let's move to internationalism, you will only intensify their pain, they will not understand you, and your ideas will not be accepted. For global integration, it's necessary to stop conflicts and raise new generations that have no personal experience of fighting, terrorism, or war. Only then will they be able to try to dissolve their identity. So let's imagine, just for a moment, what a global state would look like if it appeared tomorrow. Picture this. Overnight, all borders open. Governments vote to join a single world state, resign from power, and a global government is elected. Sounds like a miracle? Sure. But what we'd actually get is a tidal wave of problems. Mass migration. If borders are open, a huge number of migrants from third world countries will travel to the USA and Europe. This is happening even now, but if you remove all barriers, these processes will reach unprecedented scale. As a result, European and American cities will turn into ghettos. Racial and religious clashes will arise. The attractive labor conditions, the reason everyone came, will vanish because such a mass of people will collapse the value of the local workforce. Developed countries will become the biggest victims of instantaneous unification. Bureaucratic chaos. A world state. Sounds very cool, but how will the tax and customs systems work in practice? What about the healthcare system? A rapid integration without a well-thought-out, clear-phased plan could turn into a very expensive experiment. The thing is, there are very few places on Earth where everything is absolutely terrible, but there are plenty of places where everything still somehow works. If you break the old systems, but don't replace them with new ones, their functions will simply stop being performed. Pensions will not be paid, local authorities will not understand their powers, and so on. The need to subsidize poor regions. Not only would refugees flood in from the former poor countries, those regions themselves cannot be left in their current state, since now it is, after all, one country. So US environmental standards would have to apply in Somalia as well, and people could no longer dump garbage anywhere. And this means that order would have to be imposed in all the undeveloped regions. And all this will be done at whose expense? That's right, at the expense of taxpayers in developed countries, since only they have the necessary resources. Taken together with mass migration, it turns out that for developed countries, global humanity is a sentence. Risks of sliding into a world dictatorship or dystopia. If you have one state, you are effectively putting all your money on the line. The gain will either be very large or you will lose everything. The same here. If the political system turns out to be imperfect and brings a dictator to power, it will be extremely difficult to remove them. If inhumane practices are introduced in the name of security, it will be very hard to stop them. Right now, if such things are done by, say, China, other countries watch, and if this experience proves unattractive, they won't allow a similar solution in their own country. In a global state, the scope for such experiments would be greatly reduced. Risk of planetary anarchy, clan wars, and cyberpunk. It's entirely possible that we wouldn't get a strong dictatorship at all. On the contrary, everything could sink into bureaucracy, and the world government could become some detached from reality crap like the modern UN. There would be no governments left with real power, and the rule of the strong would prevail on the planet. Power would pass to corporations, clans, nationalist and religious groups. Chaos would begin, with constant clashes, etc. So if a global state arose spontaneously as a crude, ill-thought-out experiment, we would definitely end up with a world worse than the one we live in now. But does that mean that a better version of the world with a global state is impossible? What might it look like under the best possible circumstances? Global humanity, a well-thought-out collective project, the solution to all of history's problems, a world in which corruption, greed, and selfishness have been overcome. This is a civilizational system of a new era. It sounds beautiful, but how could it work in practice? Here I will try to fantasize a bit. I do not claim to have the final answer, as this is an extremely difficult topic to predict, so I will treat many things quite hypothetically. So we've united the planet. All the acts have been signed and a world government elected. How to solve the problem of mass migration? For example, one could temporarily limit free movement around the planet by dividing it into regions by level of development, as well as introducing a system of ratings or qualification tests. That means you can't just move to another region if you are a toxic or marginalized element of society. The system would have to filter you out, but at the same time motivate you towards self-development by showing better prospects. A second safeguard against spontaneous migration could be a powerful investment program or lending to underdeveloped regions. Currently, security is a big obstacle for corporations to invest in such places, but in a global state, this security would be guaranteed. Local authorities would not be able to seize a company's assets, and gangs would not be able to oppose the world police. Such rules of the game would greatly increase the investment attractiveness of underdeveloped regions for businesses, quickly making them less underdeveloped. What to do about bureaucratic chaos? Looking at the modern European Union, I'm frightened by how such a powerful and good idea gets smashed against bureaucracy. We really don't want to carry this problem over to all humanity. So, to prevent that, even before integration, we would need to carefully plan, analyze, and approve the future state or superstate structure, as well as a clear decision-making algorithm in case some people disagree. It's very important not to render humanity impotent in decision-making, and to immediately adopt and implement effective rules of the game. Right now, I will not propose my superficial plan of the state apparatus and structure of such a state, but if you find this topic interesting, write a comment about it, and I will definitely record another video where I think in detail about a good version of how a world state might work from a technical perspective. For example, what kind of government it should have, tax and economic systems, the lawmaking process, elections, the judicial system, etc., the need to subsidize poor regions. This problem can be solved if subsidies are turned into investments and loans. The most important thing is to guarantee the protection of these investments and create an effective motivation system for them. This would allow the economies of underdeveloped regions, and with them the level of societal development, to rise rapidly. Regarding the risk of sliding into dictatorship. The first question: what form of government should a quality world state have? Honestly, I don't have the answer. I really don't care much for democracy either, but so far it's the best thing humanity has invented. However, whatever it is, it's extremely important to implement a mechanism for recalling the political leadership. Imagine a blockchain mechanism. Currently, cryptocurrencies spend a huge amount of energy for one purpose: to guarantee in a decentralized way the impossibility of forging information. That is, it is impossible to steal a Bitcoin or somehow manipulate its transactions. For Bitcoin, this might be unjustifiably expensive, but for world stability, it's a minuscule price. Let there be a president, a parliament, or even an emperor of the planet in power. Each citizen has a remove button. If 50% of Earthlings plus one person presses it, the leader loses power. This is what I call freedom. It may not be democracy, and perhaps that right could be manipulated, but it's an insurance, a very strong and good insurance. I think such a powerful project simply needs it. The possibility to remove the ruler early, by decision of the majority of Earthlings without a revolution. Maybe it would make sense to require 55% of votes, or to allow some time for reconfirmation of such a decision. Maybe those who have the right to press the button should first be checked for adequacy. For example, like after school, a person takes exams. If someone has absolutely no education, or just 3 classes obtained in who knows where, then it's not worth giving them such a right. Of course, this is debatable, but the mere possibility of recalling power is necessary. Regarding the risk of sliding into anarchy, it is much higher than the risk of dictatorship, because national states will not want to disappear on their own, and even if governments formally sign the integration, they will want to keep as many powers for themselves as possible. Then the world state might turn out to be just a fiction. To avoid anarchy, a very clear global state project is needed, one that is understandable to the general public and one in which people themselves would want to live. Otherwise, it will be a doomed, artificial construct. In the good scenario, we get a strong centralized power with a clear strategic vision, an understanding of the system it is building. Not just an administrative one, but a civilizational one. If we are lucky and all circumstances fall into place favorably, most of the problems described above would be solved at the planning stage, as anticipated challenges rather than unforeseen catastrophes. Then, having gone through the inevitable difficult organizational period, humanity would ultimately reach the desired trajectory, a world without borders, wars, crises, and catastrophes catastrophes, a world in which robots work for people, the cult of science, medicine, enlightenment, absolute security, space exploration, the very world that today we call utopia. If we analyze everything said above, one can conclude that the unification of humanity into a single state is for us as far away as a turtle is from Mars. This idea, to say the least, is unpopular. There are no real projects showing how it could work in practice. More than 200 national governments do not want to lose power, as do the economic elites linked to them. The masses themselves have very strong national feelings. If not all, then many groups and peoples have such a pronounced identity that they would shake such a community from within. It follows that we cannot build a single government until we form a single morality, a common system of values, and a shared vision of the future. The planet will only be able to unite when humanity unites. And perhaps a global state is not a guaranteed future, but our civilization's test?